Hi, it's Jenny Gillen here, and I was sent this question, so I figured it was actually quicker to do a video than to answer it, and thought that maybe other people might want the answer as well. So the question was, when discussing balance of instrumental lines, can we talk about other elements of music? I learned that we can only talk about instruments and their role in the melody. I read your sample responses for VCAR 2015 question 17B from the website and was unsure how to approach the question with balance and blend of instrumental lines voices. Okay, so there's a few parts to that question. To start off with, can we talk about other elements of music when we are talking about balance? Absolutely, and I think we need to. It's a bit like dynamics. You can say what the dynamic is, you can say it's loud, but unless you give analysis of that and say why it is loud, you haven't really answered the question. So you could say the melody is in the foreground, which is fine. But if you're not saying why the melody is in the foreground, you're probably not answering the question as fully as possible. So if you say that you're only allowed to talk about instruments and their role in the melody, I think there's a bigger degree, which is why they are in the particular place in the balance that they are. So when I talk about balance, I talk about the foreground, the midground, and the background, which are actually terms taken from art. And the reasons why something is in the foreground, the midground, or the background is often to do with the dynamics, how loud something is. If something is louder, it tends to be in the foreground. If it's softer, it tends to be more in the background. Other things, though, that you might want to mention are things like the tone color. If the tone colors are brighter or harsher, they may well be in the foreground, whereas if they're more mellow and warm, they may be further in the background. The other thing is the roles within the instruments themselves. So in the foreground, you would have melodies, but there are also things like counter melodies, rhythmic roles, and harmonic roles. If a harmonic role is particularly loud, maybe it is actually competing for prominence, is one of my favorite terms, competing for prominence or competing for its place in the foreground because it's so loud against the melody that it drowns it out. Now, the other thing that's worth mentioning when you're talking about blend and balance, particularly in balance, is texture, musical texture, because there's a whole swathe of vocabulary that musicians use to describe what the balance is. And they are things like homophonic, which means that the melody is in the foreground and there's one melody that's in the foreground and there's an accompaniment. Then you have to describe those roles. So you could say the ascending chromatic melody in the flute is accompanied by arpeggiated diatonic strings or something like that. So that's what I would be doing in terms of a balance. I would say what the roles are. So what is in the foreground, the midground, the background, what influence put them there, and what the texture was, the resulting texture was. Of course, there's a couple of chapters in my book about blend and balance. So going through those, the sample questions and the teaching in the books is probably a good place to start. The other one is blend. For me, blend is pretty much a tone color question, though there are other reasons why something might blend really well. So if the tone colors are all similar, the sound will blend well. If the tone colors are very different to each other, they might not blend as well. So one last thing in terms of those things is please make sure that you use whatever terminology is in the question in your answer. So if it talks about blend, make sure you use the word blend well, even if it's in a negative sense, and say this doesn't blend as well as whatever else you're talking about. In terms of what you're told by other teachers, there are lots of teachers, music teachers, who are working very hard, and there are lots of discussion and disagreement sometimes about what to actually include. But I think as long as you are testing the ground and trying to answer using appropriate vocab and all those sorts of things, you're on the right track. So best of luck, and I hope that answered your question. Bye.